So I saw, no. Thanks, Tony. I saw some good news in the paper today. Did you all see that outside of your rooms? It was right on the front page. They don't give you the newspaper in front of your room?
Will you step over it?
I mean, it's US Day today. I'd probably step over it usually too. But there was a headline here that caught my attention as I was stumbling out of my room. And it says, first 4 billion bypasses states hit hardest. How big was the stimulus? Quote, stimulus. About 700 billion, about 800 billion actually, or 700 and change. This is the first, quote, 4 billion being spent now, when already some of the leading indicators are showing start of recovery. First 4. And they're pointing out in this little article, funds flow where jobs aren't scarce. So they're looking which states this lousy 4 billion is going to. They point out that Michigan, one of the states hit hardest, 21 cents per person is what has made it there from this, quote, stimulus so far. The stimulus was nothing other than an excuse for them to spend money on things that they wanted to anyway. I expected to, I'm not going to get back into business cycles. That's how Tony did his trick. I said, how did you make the microphone go louder when you put it in your nose? When you do something, oh, see? It echoes it down. Pretty cool. All right. So today's topic isn't business cycle or nose and microphone tricks. It's that's worse than when I open the window in the morning. Today's first topic is economic freedom. Or specifically economic freedom and growth and what the relationship between the two is. So first, what do we mean by economic freedom? Who can define economic freedom for me? Anyone want to give it a stab? There we go, thank you, one. Freedom from government regulation. That's part of it. Yeah.
Freedom to buy or sell without control.
Free to buy or sell without control. I think that's kind of getting it. By control, you mean control by somebody other than the buyers and the sellers. Yeah. It's basically buying and abstention from buying. Do you have the freedom to buy what you want when you want or sell what you want when you want without outside influence? So government regulation is certainly part of it, but it would also be like private interference too, of criminals coming in and stealing from you. So part of it's going to be security of property rights. So Tony's talk yesterday involved property rights quite a bit. So are you secure in your possessions that if you don't want to give them up, you don't have to? But overall what we're talking about is the freedom to enter into voluntary agreements on any terms that two parties choose. And that freedom can be interfered with by private parties or quite often by governments. So that's kind of what we're getting at when we're talking about economic freedom. It doesn't mean, and don't get me started on voting this early in the morning, it doesn't mean political freedom or ability to vote for who you want. It has nothing to do with that. It's about buying and selling products. It also doesn't mean freedom of speech. This is just measuring economic transactions, basically the security of life and property and your ability to trade property. It doesn't mean these other things aren't important. It just means economic freedom is separate from that. So we have two different measures of these that are typically used. Two different economic freedom indexes. None of you even told me that was that bad. How's that? Everyone's head hurt a little less? Mine doesn't. So there's two indexes that look at these. One is the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Annual Report. The other is co-published by the Heritage Foundation and the Wall Street Journal, the Economic Freedom Index. Both of these, when we start using them empirically, often give you relatively similar results. In fact, I did a paper 4 or 5 years ago that put the two of them side by side and looked at a bunch of things, and the story's pretty much the same between them. Despite that, there are some differences. an advantage of the Wall Street Journal Heritage Foundation one is it covers more countries, roughly 155, 154, 55, I think, in the latest one. The Fraser Institute is around 125, something like that. The Heritage one's been annual since 1995. The Fraser Institute's one started also in 1995 and was sporadic for a few years and has been annual since 2000. But a big advantage of the Fraser Institute's index is that they've gone back and they've weighted countries in prior years. So in 5-year intervals, you have back through 1970. So it makes it more useful for scholars doing longitudinal studies on the effects of economic freedom, or for that matter, what causes economic freedom. Along with that, part of the reason for the difference in countries, in coverage of countries, is that the Heritage Index quite often is a little bit more subjective, of people sitting around and deciding how free has this country become, what has changed there. It's not necessarily always based on hard, observable data. So those are the two main indexes. What are they measuring? I've kind of said it's economic freedom, not political freedom. The way that, and I'll talk pretty much mostly about the Fraser Index from here on out. They find 37 different variables across 5 broad categories. 5 broad categories being the size of the government, legal structure and property rights, how secure are your property rights there, access to sound money. So one thing that looks at is the inflation rate in your economy, making sure that you're not eroding the buying power of people from the transaction, but also, even depending what you have on your inflation rate, do you have access to foreign currencies? So if you want to just personally dollarize, can you do that, or are there foreign exchange controls that prevent you from getting that currency? Freedom to trade internationally, so looks at tariff rates, quotas, stuff like that. And then the last one, regulation of credit, labor, and business. So this gets to the first definition I was hearing from you. That's one of their main categories, is how regulated are labor markets, credit markets, and business. So to look at things like licensure requirements for a business to get started and operating, minimum wage legislation, stuff like that. So across these 5 categories, they have 37 measures. Does this make it a perfect measure of economic freedom? No, of course not. We're measuring 37 different things. There's tons of things out there that are part of economic freedom that don't make it into the index. So there can be regulations in particular markets that don't ever show up in regulation of credit, labor, and business. So it might be, the market for barbers in one country says your barber licensing is very severe. You've got to make sure that their scissors are clean. My barber likes to tell me that barber licensing makes sense. I argue with him all the time on this. He's like, oh, you got to ensure sanitary conditions. Like, I see blood on your scissors. I'm going to be worried anyway. I can see you got a sanitizer there and you take your thing out of them. Like, why do we need licensure for that? Anyway, something like that might not make it into the index. So it's not a perfect measure, but it does hit pretty much the broad areas. I can't think of not sure how well immigration makes it into there in terms of big topics that don't make it in. But I think it covers most of the big areas and gets some decent measures, and it's fairly representative of the overall level of economic freedom in the different countries. So they measure them on a scale of 1 to 10. And, well, we also have to keep in mind that, what I just said, that it's not a perfect measure of freedom. Even then, within its own measure, 10 does not mean, like, perfect freedom, libertarian utopia. So we could think of it as, like, grading you all on a scale. Given that governments in the world suck, 10 is just, like, best above some of the others. And nobody quite makes a 10 anyway. It also, and in that, it avoids debates about what's the role of how minimal is a minimal state or should it exist at all. That's abstracted from the index. We're basically looking for something that's a fairly fairly classical liberal society for a 10, at least in the economic realm. But just because you hit a 10 doesn't mean you're perfectly free, even on their own grounds. So, which countries are the freest in the world? What's the most economically free country in the world? Any ideas? Not New Zealand. They get up high. I heard Singapore. Singapore does very well. They're actually number 2. Hong Kong, yes. Hong Kong actually has scored the highest on the index every year since it first came out. This is a couple of years old on the index here. By the way, if you go to the website, freetheworld.org, that's where you have tons of resources on economic freedom, where they have the current and all of the past versions of the index, chapters from the book that actually look at different research questions, and tons of papers exploring the effects or causes of economic freedom on freetheworld.org. But yeah, Hong Kong's the most free. The index here that I have, they had a score of 8.7 that year. Singapore was second, and since I think 1975, Hong Kong and Singapore have been the top 2 every year. Hong Kong's been the top every year. Someone else mentioned Switzerland. They're relatively high at just over 8, and New Zealand as well. UK and the United States usually come in about that range too. Australia, Canada, Ireland, Luxembourg slightly below. In general, this top group, they shuffle positions a little bit year to year, but they tend to remain kind of the same people. Some interesting other countries. Estonia, one of the most successful transition economies in Eastern Europe, scores very high in economic freedom. They went from a socialist system to a very capitalist one fairly quickly and effectively compared to everybody else who did. One of the advantages for Estonia, of course, in this transition was that they were part of a problem of transition is you have to privatize state assets. But a lot of the state assets, in particular the places that emphasized heavy industry, had a lot of negative value added businesses there. Industries where they actually, when they close, that adds value to the economy because you are taking valuable resources, destroying those resources in production and making something else. That makes the privatization and transition process a bit harder. Estonia was relatively unburdened by that, and that certainly helped there. But also intellectual entrepreneurship there and young people who were pushing for greater freedoms and economic freedoms in Estonia was key. And they've shot up very high in the rankings. Germany comes in ahead of much of Europe, but at mid-20s. Chile in Latin America is an interesting one. The highest ranked country in terms of economic freedom in Latin America. Does that seem a little bit weird? No. No. Who said no? Why? Oh, why?
Pinochet and Milton Friedman, and nearly after the fall of Allende, they instituted quite a bit of number of reforms, almost immediately in 1973. But I shouldn't speak, there's a Chilean here.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah.
The very good big change was that when Pinochet took the control of the state against the communists, he took a group of people that were called the Chicago Boys.
Mm-hmm.
They were all like professionals that had recently studied in the University of Chicago, and they create a completely new system. Like Pinochet destroyed the institution, and these guys like create in like a month, a year, a new system based in all liberal political ideas. So it was like the first country in Latin America. In my opinion, it's still the only one that follows the freedom economic policy. And that's the difference with why Chile is a stable country. There is not a big revolution, and it doesn't matter if a president is socialist or capitalist. The both sides are following these same rules.
Yeah.
So it's very similar to the United States in that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not going to repeat all that through the microphone. I imagine you guys mostly heard. I'm sorry for people listening on the internet. This is a great point because a lot of people in America will say, how could it be Chile with Pinochet happen? Because they'll say it's a dictator and a brutal one at that. But this is separating economic freedom from political freedom here. Despite all of the problems for human rights and other things that Pinochet caused. In terms of economic policy, you're exactly right. His advisors were all influenced by University of Chicago economists who wanted to implement free markets there. And they brought a lot of these policies in, got them in place, and then eventually more political freedom was demanded afterwards. Long afterwards. But the economic freedom was in place and the growth started occurring there ahead of time, and it remains the most free country, economically free country in Latin America today. And I've actually heard, and I'm not positive of this argument, whether it's right or wrong, but my tendency is to think it probably is to claim that on net Pinochet probably saved lives. For all of the things that he did that were bad, the economic growth that was ushered in by his reforms, in a sort of cliche line, wealth is health. With higher wealth, you're able to afford better health care. Probably on net saved lives. That doesn't mean that he's not guilty of human rights violations and could be condemned for that. But it's probably true that there's more people there alive today because of the economic growth that occurred under him. So a lot of people in America who aren't familiar with the situation down there don't know the story you were telling and how the freedom increased during that time. Another one that's kind of surprising on this list, at least for a lot of people, Sweden. What do you think of when you think of Sweden?
Socialist.
I just heard someone say socialist. A lot of people do. That's the, actually, you're from Sweden, right? No. Russia, that's right. Oh, I should have known that. Yeah. A lot of people say Sweden's the socialist model, the big welfare state. And it does have a big welfare state with a lot of transfers. But remember, the broad index, what this is trying to measure here, is overall economic freedom, not just welfare state transfers. And when you actually look at Sweden and the components of the index, they score very poorly on size of government. The government takes a lot of money from some people and transfers it to others, obviously interfering with your economic freedom to use your goods the way you would like to. But on the other things, it's pretty free to trade internationally. They've had a stable monetary regime for a long time. Regulation of many aspects of credit and business isn't too bad there. A bit more on the labor side. Stability of property rights and protection of private property rights is real good. It's really just that size of government that they take a big hit on, but that doesn't mean socialist. It means you have a lot of forced transfers between people. And that's bad, and it does negatively impact freedom, but most of the other aspects of economic freedom are actually pretty good there. So a lot of people will say, when they say to you, if you're talking about free markets and why free markets are necessary for prosperity, they'll say, look at Sweden. Sweden's socialist and they're wealthy. Point out to them, they have big transfers, but they're much more capitalistic than a lot of people give them credit for. They score highly in economic freedom, so it's not like a counterpoint to our usual examples. It fits in. And along with that, plug, by the way, for the book that I had come out last year, Making Poor Nations Rich. I have a chapter in there on Sweden from a guy named Dan Johansson from the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, and it's on Sweden. And what he points out is Sweden used to be a lot more free than it is today. And what started happening in the particularly the early 1970s, were increases in the welfare state there and also regulations, particularly in labor. And as a result, Sweden went from one of the wealthiest countries in the OECD to in the bottom half in terms of wealth in the OECD. They didn't, on an absolute sense, get poorer, but their growth rate, where they were relative to everybody else, slowed down. Other people started surpassing them and going by. So they maintain a high standard of living and are mostly economically free, but as they've lost economic freedoms, their rate of growth and dynamism has gone down. Other interesting ones here. What did someone say? Venezuela. Okay, we'll get there. Hang on. Japan. Now at 36, still relatively free, but they've lost a lot of ground, in fact. In 1970, they were in, I think, number 8 in the world, maybe, in terms of economic freedom. And plausibly, if you went back to Japan in the 1960s, there's a lot of things that would make me think that Japan was even more free in the 60s than they were then. But a lot of backsliding, and a lot of it happened because of that lost decade of growth and all the interventions into the economy during that decade that have kind of pulled them down. France, well, people in America, scoff at France and say, "Oh, French, yeah, they're definitely behind and more socialistic than places like Sweden, but still 44 in the world, not horrible." China, and I'm going to come back to China. Actually, I'll come back to China later. Well down in terms of economic freedom, but a big changer. I'll come back and talk about them. Is there somebody here who I heard yell out Venezuela? They wanted to talk about it? They wanted to say something? Yes?
Basically, I'm assuming it has changed a lot in the last 10 years with Chavez.
Yeah, probably more. If I got the so one thing is these indexes are always lagging. So the 2009 index would have 2007 data. This one here is a couple of years old. But take a look. They only rank like 125 countries. They're already at 118. So I don't know how much worse they could get in relative terms to everybody else. But certainly some deterioration that's happened there, yeah. And the reason the index is on the 2-year lag like that is not that it takes them so long to do it. It's because their index is based off of publicly available data. They have to wait for the data to be published before it makes it into the index. So that's what keeps it a little bit behind.
Correct to assume the United States is slipping because of our government spending more and consuming more narcotics?
Yeah, so I'd expect the size of government ranking in this would certainly be impacted by the tremendous amount of spending that's happening in the United States right now. I don't think very much that's happened in terms of regulation since the crisis would make it into the index. I'd have to think a little bit more about how any of it might make it in, but I think it's going to be missed by most of that. Future inflation from all of the monetary creation here, that'll make it into the index and impact the U.S.'s score significantly. Those are probably the two main things stemming out of the crisis, the overall spending level and monetary creation that might make it in and decrease the U.S.'s score.
About taking over the bank sector and all of it, doesn't that in some way impact the regulations of markets and things of that nature? Right.
So, absolutely yes, it does, and that decreases economic freedom, no doubt about it. I'm thinking about, in terms of the measurement in this index, I'm not clear that it would pick it up. The nationalization of banks probably would, but simply like the auto firm stuff, I don't think it's going to make it in there.
Yeah, probably not. But on the list, you said something along the lines about regulation of credit markets.
Yep. Yes, but so it's regulation of credit, labor, and business. Within that, there's individual components. So regulation of credits, are there interest rate controls that can be extended on credit? So they have like a couple distinct pieces of data in there, and unless our new regulation directly impacts those, it'll be missed by the index. The whole reason is they need ones that are consistent across countries so that we can compare apples to apples. So we need to pick regulations that we can get publicly available data on, and that's a clear numeric comparison between different countries. So it's just limited in how fine it can be if they want it to be useful in terms of broad comparisons between countries. That's why I say it's not the be-all and end-all measure. Everything that he's mentioned is clearly something that decreases economic freedom in America. It just might not make it into the score. So that said, it still does, I think, a reasonable job of getting at overall levels in the countries. And someone the other day had asked me about optimism. And with all I had said about public choice, how could I still remain relatively optimistic? And this is one of the main reasons why. Huge increase in economic freedom over the last 20 years or so. So this is looking at all of the countries in the world as what's happened from 1980 to 1990, a big improvement, and then from 1990 to 2002, overall levels of all the countries in the world. Big improvements, and at the same time, big intellectual victories during this time of defeating bad economic ideas. And collapse of communism makes it in here, and all of a sudden you get a whole bunch of countries that come into the index around now that have very low economic freedom scores, but start improving over this time. Some of them anyway. There's some other big improvers in the world that I'll get to and talk about in just a minute. But the overall trend is the world's getting more free economically. So look at a few selected countries and what's happened with them. Who knows anything about Botswana? Who's heard of Botswana? All right, we've heard of it. What have you heard about them? Anything in specific? Yeah. Relatively good governance. She says especially in recent years. That's, I'm not sure about especially in recent years, but definitely they've got a trend of good governance. Yes?
I'm actually from Botswana.
You're from Botswana. Excellent.
I think the whole economic freedom thing is made easier by the whole respect of the liberalism law, and we're forever seeking foreign direct investment.
Please try to speak louder for everybody, because I'm not going to be able to repeat everything that you said.
The economy is relatively open, and we're forever seeking foreign direct investment. We've had political stability since independence, and so it's quite easy for the whole freedom thing.
Yeah, that whole freedom thing. It exists in Botswana more than any other country in Africa, and has for years. And in fact, if someone just asked you who was the fastest growing country in the world from the mid-60s to the mid-90s, the answer is Botswana. And almost nobody you encounter would actually give you that answer. Now, of course, it was starting from a very low level of GDP per capita in 1965 or so, but significant rate of growth for like a 30-year period. It still grows fairly well. Yeah.
I wanted to ask is, I thought I had heard, is Botswana the only African country which was actually, its borders were actually created according to tribal lines, whereas a lot of others were dictated by Europeans? Or am I...
That's not really true.
Okay.
It's just the same thing applies to all the countries. Because we're colonized by Britain, right? So they didn't actually know our tribes. Yeah. So when they were dividing, it was between them and the Dutch. So,
Okay.
yeah.
There were a couple unique things though that relate to the prior tribal leadership there, and one is the election of the first president, right? They picked a traditional tribal leader who became the leader of the country then. And what happened there, part of the other interesting part is, as far as people knew, what did Botswana have for natural resources in the 1960s and before?
We're very lucky because even the British or the Dutch, they never knew there were diamonds.
They never knew there were diamonds there. In fact, it came after independence. What did they think of for resources? Basically nothing. Fairly arid place. It was a British protectorate, and they didn't spend very much time extracting resources because they didn't think there was very much to extract. So they largely left internal governance structures alone. So there was a question last night up there about informal and cultural norms into property rights systems or something like that. And in Botswana, part of, and I'm not an expert on Botswana. One of my buddies has done a lot of research on it, Scott Bullier, and I recommend some of his papers. In fact, I've heard him talk about it so many times, he started calling me Ben Swana. In there, the formal property rights and legal system that emerged was based on the prior tribal system that was already there, and they selected a traditional leader. So it wasn't a disjoint like many African countries where you have this informal governance structure and property rights, and then you had the external colonialism governing you, and then that was taken away. It was like, oh, here's a Western constitution and a Western government. This is your new system that was at a disjoint with its old system. Instead, there's much more consistency there, and it's a consistency that respects property rights and, which you said, basic economic freedoms, freedoms to trade with other people. So Botswana was a place where they didn't have great natural resources to start with. Partly it was, this is what I think Tony mentioned it yesterday, the natural resource curse. So if you haven't heard what the natural resource curse is, just watch the movie Blood Diamond. That basically illustrates the whole thing, right? There's a big diamond there. What does everybody spend the entire movie doing? Running around and shooting at each other, trying to get it for themselves. That's time spent essentially rent-seeking, but not time spent creating wealth for others. There, since there wasn't that much to fight over, it was doing things in trade that creates wealth for others, which is good for society's overall growth. Later, of course, diamonds were discovered. And actually, this is why I'm skeptical of the better governance in even recent years, is what Scott points out, Scott Bullier points out in some of his research is, Botswana traditionally had a very, very limited government. As diamond revenues have increased, that's pushed money into the government coffers, and the government's got bigger and bigger along with the diamond revenues. And now there's worry also that, and that, by the way, doesn't make it into the Economic Freedom Index because it's not like an official taxation that's economy-wide. In fact, it's hard to get data on at all because it's basically an agreement between the government and the diamond company how much of their revenue they get to steal. The government gets to take, I don't know if steal, how much of the revenue the government gets to take, but it's not any official taxation, so it's not in here. So that growth of that is missing here. But one of the worries is as diamonds dry up more, what are you going to do with a bigger government now and still the same economy? Are you all of a sudden, is it going to shrink back, or is it going to have to go there to steal resources from everybody else to maintain itself? So that's one of the current worries there. But the big picture here is, though, there's nothing, it's not that Africa can't grow. With the right institutions and property rights, Africa can certainly grow, and Botswana is a great the best example, I think, of it there. The problem is that so often the institutions are lacking there. And there was a little bit of discussion about aid and giving out money to countries, and the track record of foreign aid in terms of promoting development is just disastrous. When we look at post-World War II years, what are the countries that you'd say, other than Botswana, are the big growth successes post-World War II? South Korea. Taiwan. Germany. Japan. England stagnated pretty bad, and then they started coming back in the late 80s. Brazil a little bit. Singapore, Hong Kong. The big ones I'm thinking of are the Asian tigers, right? Foreign aid was a very small part of their growth. Excuse me, a very small part of their overall funding. And I'd say overall probably detrimental to their growth. There was Marshall Plan in Europe, Germany, Japan. Germany's an interesting story. When does their growth take off? When they ignore the United States rule and abolish price controls overnight. Places where there's been lots of foreign aid, you don't see very much growth. Sub-Saharan Africa from 1970 through 2000 had a negative per capita growth rate. Actually got poorer, despite hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign aid funneling into the area. So fundamentally, aid doesn't create the institutions necessary to promote capitalism and gains from trade. Those institutions, there's not, I think I said it in the questions last night, there's not multiple paths to prosperity. You need private property rights and economic freedoms. But those have to be consistent with your culture and your customary legal systems. And aid doesn't do anything to promote that. You need more cases like Botswana where they build out of their customary legal systems in Africa and grow into these more modern economic freedom and property rights systems. George Aidi is an economist. He's from Ghana originally, and he teaches at American University, and he's great on this point. He says, Africa traditionally has mostly been free trade. Customs between tribes involved tons of trade. They weren't anti-money. He says what happened though is under colonialism, these tribal institutions only ordered our internal affairs. They never grew up with the rest of international trade. Now what we've got at the end of colonialism is just forced new institutions on us that don't jive with our old ones. Those old ones need to grow and merge into the modern economy, but that's a spontaneous order process. This customary law has to evolve. He actually makes the argument we need to distinguish between what he called modern Africa and traditional Africa. And he says traditional Africa is friendly to trade. Modern Africa are nation states that were imposed on them that isn't modern at all, really. It's just resource extraction for the wealthy elite who control that state versus the population. And he says, unfortunately, what foreign aid does is foreign aid focuses almost exclusively on this, quote, modern sector and ignores the traditional sector. And it's the traditional sector that has sustained the population for centuries and that modern institutions need to grow out of. So he actually says, he's got a very radical line in the book that I put together, The Making Poor Nations Rich, in his chapter in there. He says the modern African nation state should be left to the fate it deserves: implosion and state collapse. He thinks it's inherently unreformable. But that doesn't mean anarchy in the sense of chaos. What it means is a return to those traditional forms of governance and then let them grow and evolve and create orders that are more consistent with the culture there and more consistent with property rights than what the states are. There's another talk I give at FEE, I'll give at the Young Scholars Conference, I don't give it on here, is actually at the about Somalia and state collapse and implosion in Somalia. And they do have a customary legal system there, so I get into details of how their customary legal system works, and then to the extent we can get data, what's happened to their relative growth compared to other sub-Saharan African countries since that state collapse. And overall what we find is their customary legal systems are slow to evolve, but are evolving and providing an internal order that's increasing living standards compared to when they had a state and compared to the average sub-Saharan African country. And that there's probably more scope for this in some of the other countries if they could let those traditional sectors flourish more. And Botswana is kind of the unique example of the one who went from colonialism and really grew those institutions into something that is more consistent with modern society. I won't talk about all of these countries as long as we talked about Botswana, but I think Botswana is a cool one that's worth talking about. Chile we already did, so actually I'll skip it. China. So, like, for those of you, you're out there and you're in conversations with people, it seems like the main conversation objections you get if you're talking about what you need for prosperity and long-term growth is economic freedom. People will say three different things to you. Sweden, I already talked about them a little bit. China, look, they're growing and they're communist. And maybe India, they're growing and they're not very free. Definitely true, China is not very free by the way the index measures it. I think I said it, in this particular one it ranked 90. It's still relatively high, relatively low in the rankings, high in its number. But all that matters isn't your level of freedom. Your level of freedom matters. But in terms of growth, changes in freedom matter huge. In fact, empirically, when we start looking at this, changes in freedom matter more than levels. And China went from a situation starting with reforms with Deng Xiaoping to now where they've increased economic freedom tremendously. Starting admittedly from a very low level and not making it anywhere near where I'd like to see them get. But from about 3.8 in 1980 up to 5.7. In percentage terms, this is a big increase. And in China, this misses part of the increase too, because in China, this is looking at just national government policies, the Economic Freedom Index. In China, a lot of the economic freedoms that have been granted aren't done for the entire country. They're done on a regional basis. Different provinces gain economic freedom. So there's a Marketization Index, actually, which is similar to the Economic Freedom Index for the different regions of China. And they're finding big disparities between regions of China in terms of the amount of marketization or economic freedoms that have been granted there. Because a lot of the reform there starts at the local level and isn't officially sanctioned until afterwards by the central government. So even this understates their change in economic freedom, which also, by the way, when people say, look at inequality, and China is increasing. Yeah, of course it is. Everybody used to be all poor, and now some people aren't. There's some growth. Inequality has increased. But it also has increased in accord with the changes within the regions of marketization. Those regions that have become more market-oriented have grown more. The other ones have been left behind. So in terms of thinking about changes in freedom versus freedom for economic growth as we measure it, think about like what the normal path of evolution is for a growing economy. The joke between about an economist, not a particularly good joke, but an illustrative one in this case, is there's two economists walking down the sidewalk, the graduate student and the senior colleague, and the graduate student says, "Oh, look, there's a $100 bill," as he points down to the sidewalk. And the senior colleague says, "No, there's not. If it was, it would have already been picked up." Basically a notion of we're in equilibrium always. Now, of course, we're not in equilibrium always. There's always a tendency towards equilibrium. But how many of you have ever found a $100 bill on a sidewalk? One? You did? Congratulations. It was a very good day, I'm sure. It doesn't usually happen. I don't know, what do we have in here? 50, 60 people, and one person in their life has found one? It's a rare occurrence. How many of you have even found a $20 bill on the sidewalk? Few of you. Actually, most of you. So we're not in equilibrium always. But how many of you stepped over that $20 bill and ignored it? Nobody. So the idea is that when they're there, they get picked up, and they get picked up pretty quickly. They don't hang around for days sitting on the sidewalk. Well, same thing kind of with entrepreneurial discoveries. So profit opportunities for entrepreneurs are situations where there's bills on the sidewalk. There's some inefficiency in the economy that if they correct, they can make a profit by doing it. Entrepreneurs seize those opportunities. So there's always this grasping of opportunities. But what happens when all of a sudden you have a repressed economy? There might be changes in underlying technology, consumer preferences that generate what would be a profit opportunity. But because, let's say, they're going to tax 90% of your profits, you don't bother picking it up. It would be like, would you bend over and pick up the $20 bill if all you got was a penny for doing so? Or it might be regulations that prevent you from starting the business in the first place or entering that market. So it would be like walking down the sidewalk and you're standing on a metal grate that's above that. And like the normal course of the economy is $20 bills pop up. They're there on the sidewalk, they pop. But when they pop, they usually get grabbed. In this case, you get this metal grate over it, and underlying conditions are changing. $20 bills are popping up all over the place, but you can't grasp them. There's institutional barriers there, lack of economic freedom that you can't get down and get the bills. So it's not kind of surprising when you think of entrepreneurial opportunities like this, that when you see a big change in freedom, you see a huge flurry in growth. Even though the absolute level of freedom may still be bad, it would be like that grate on the sidewalk drops down a whole bunch. All of a sudden, now you can get at some of these $20 bills. So there's a flurry of activity where everyone's grasping those. That shows up as quick measured growth. Now, it might still be that that metal grate has farther to go. Like in China's case, it's got much farther to go. But the big lowering of it gets you a lot of profit opportunities that previously they had been popping up just like normal in a normal economy, but you couldn't get at, so you get the big flurry of growth around them. So most of the literature that examines this stuff finds that changes in freedom actually matter even more than absolute levels. So levels matter, but changes really drive a lot of a growth sport. In China, it's a prime example of how increases in economic freedom bring greater prosperity. Same is true with India on a smaller scale and for a smaller time period. They weren't as low as China, and they've improved. They certainly have a long way to go as well, but their reforms started around 1991. Well, they had reforms in the 1980s, but the major reforms start after a financial crisis in 1991, where they've, in particular, opened themselves up to more international trade and international capital movements, and have grown quite a bit as a result. And in fact, the growth, while in China, the inequality is kind of more regional of who is marketized more than other regions. In India, it's more by industry. So industries that are outside of the old licensing regime have benefited a lot from the growth. People who work in the traditional sectors that were licensed, in particular agricultural products, transport, and weaving, they haven't experienced very much of the growth. They've been left behind because those regulations prevented their sectors. Instead, it's telecommunications, which did receive increases in economic freedom, and technology in terms of software and stuff that simply didn't exist under the old regime and popped up too quick and grew fast afterwards. So there it's like a sectoral inequality. Those who are outside the restrictions grow, those who are inside it get stuck. Yeah?
It's interesting, just doing a little calculation about what you said about changes in levels of freedom and the relationship to growth. In India versus China, you see that it's about a 50% increase in the level of freedom versus around a 30% increase.
Mm-hmm.
And you also see a reflection in that in terms of the level of economic growth.
Yep.
Disparity between those two countries.
Yep, I think that's exactly true. Yeah. Ireland and New Zealand, so both of these are relatively free countries at the start, but make big improvements. I'll say Ireland in particular, I'm probably not going to go into as much detail here as I do sometimes. I actually give a talk on economic freedom and growth, the case of the Celtic Tiger. And Ireland was a traditional laggard in Europe in terms of standard of living. It sat at about 2/3 the level of Great Britain's standard of living, and did for most of the last half of the 20th century. Northern Ireland too, which of course is ruled by Britain, same thing, so the whole island did. But in the Republic of Ireland, what they started doing after a mid-1980s financial crisis they're one of the few places that actually really slashed the role of government in the economy in terms of slashing the size of government. So for all of the, quote, Reagan revolution and Thatcher movement in Britain, while there was no kind of ideological revolution in Ireland, in terms of actually reducing the government's role in the economy, they did much, much more there than they did in the United States or the UK. They went from a situation where government was consuming more than 55% of GDP in 1985. So more than half of all of the goods and services produced in Ireland consumed by government in 1985. That fell to about 40% by 1990. And further after that, when they start running budget surpluses, so tax revenue is even greater than what the government spending is, that gets down to about 33% of GDP. Very few other countries go from government stealing 55% of the resources to dropping down to 33 in a pretty short period of time. There was a dramatic change there. It was all in response to a fiscal crisis. There was no ideological revolution. In fact, the prime minister who got elected during that crisis was one of the same prime ministers who was a big spender in the 1970s that put the debt together, and he explicitly ran on a platform that he wasn't going to slash government spending. But then he got in office, and they're part of the European monetary system, and they had prior bouts of inflation. If they inflated, it would have put pressure to change their exchange rates. They didn't want to do that. They had already tried raising taxes to deal with it. They couldn't raise enough tax revenue. They had borrowed up to 116% of GDP, so debt to GDP ratio. Remember when I was telling you about the United States and where we're headed on that? Ireland had got up to 116%. They were worried that they weren't going to be able to pay their debts anymore. Basically, they were left with one choice: slash government spending, or default and have an IMF intervention. In fact, it's a perverse case, and there's a few of these out there, where the IMF has caused reform. Not because the IMF is great and does anything for the country, but because the country is so scared of dealing with the IMF that they reform themselves instead of actually getting an IMF bailout. Anyway, so Ireland did that, and of course, then it continued to improve economic freedom over the 1990s, got up to about a 10% growth rate, which for an already fairly wealthy country is very rare in the world, and they maintained it for most of the last half of the 1990s. They continued to improve economic freedom to this point. Where did I have them at in this? 7.8 in 2002. That's actually backsliding. They had been in the 8s from 95 to 2000. By 2000, their reforms had stopped, and they started backsliding a little bit. Since then, they've had a high level of freedom, but no more change in freedom. And their growth remained okay, but dropped down from the 10% levels back down to 3-4% levels. And then more recently, they've been part of the housing bubble too, and have had a lot of interventions there that are not doing particularly well. But the signals out of Ireland again seem to be, and we'll see how this plays out, that they're again going to slash government in response to it. They're not doing all of the same bailouts that everybody else is, so it'll be interesting to see if they can rekindle the success that they had after the 1985 crisis. All right. I got the 10 minutes left signal here before we should start getting ready for questions, and I've gone through like a third of my slides that I was going to talk to you about. So I'm going to summarize some of these other ones more quickly. The only one I'll point out here, I guess, is Zimbabwe. We haven't mentioned them yet. They fall at the bottom of the Fraser Index. Land reform there has created huge instability of property rights. You all probably have heard they have the highest inflation rate in the world right now, the second highest ever witnessed anywhere. In fact, they don't use the currency themselves when they're trading anymore. They use prepaid phone cards and prepaid gas cards to trade with each other. The currency is so bad. huge collapse in economic freedom. It's got worse since that 2002 ranking. They also went from a relatively successful African country to a complete basket case. There's a guy, Craig Richardson, who's done great work on Zimbabwe. And if you want a picture that's worth 1,000 words, you can find it from Google Images. If you Google Craig Richardson, land reform, Zimbabwe, tragedy of the commons, something like that. So tragedy of the commons, overexploitation of resources when everybody has common access to it. What these images show is they show pre-land reform, post-land reform, what's happened via satellite images of Zimbabwe. And they superimpose political jurisdictions on it. So the argument when land reform started was that because of prior racist policies, the whites had all of the good land and owned it, the blacks had all of the bad land. Land reform should give the blacks the whites' land. But missing in that was, what are the institutions that govern that land? Most of the blacks had access to common access to resources on the land. It was communally owned land. Most of the white land was private farms, private commercial farms that were private property. When they started changing ownership, it wasn't just changing the color of the skin that somebody owned it was the governance mechanism that governed that land. They took what was private property and they made it common property. And the commercial farms that previously had reservoirs built into them, had irrigation pipes. People, what do you do when you go onto commonly owned land with copper irrigation pipes? Cut them, take the copper, and make it a private resource of your own, sell the copper. Do you have an incentive to maintain the reservoirs? Do you have an incentive to not over-farm your land? No. So what these images do, if you Google this, I've never seen a probably better illustration pictorially of tragedy of the commons. It looks at before and after satellite pictures of the same regions and what happens in terms of blue and green that you see from the satellite, water and vegetation. And you just see a browning of the land since the land reform process has started across jurisdictions. So I highly recommend checking that out. Yeah?
You also, a lot of the best land, if I'm not mistaken, was taken by Mugabe and his elite associates, and basically just built states on them and found very productive usage of the land themselves.
Yeah, so they do that too. I don't think the pictures necessarily show that. The pictures show the other part going on. All right. These slides I can go through a lot more quickly. And this here basically kind of just puts numbers to the stories that I've been telling you about this. When we start breaking up countries, so now when we compare across countries and look at wealth and other things, what do you find? So this is breaking the economic freedom index into quintiles. So this is like the top fifth of countries, the second fifth of countries, the middle, bottom 20%'s down here. What's GDP per capita in them? So GDP per capita is not a perfect measure. There's lots of problems with it, but it's one among many measures we can look at. See tremendous differences. More free, much more wealthy. When we look at economic growth, same basic story. Freer countries grow more rapidly. When you get down to this bottom, they don't grow. They actually get smaller. Not as dramatic a difference between the lines as when I show you the wealth. Obvious reason for that. One, changes in freedom matter a lot more for growth. So you might have guys like China who sit in this area here but have made big increases. Another reason, just your level of wealth is determined by year after year of your economic growth. So if year after year someone's growing 2.4 and someone's growing 1.9, over time your wealth levels get farther and farther apart. This is that marketization index in China. Same basic story there. Regions of China that have become more market-orientated have higher levels of wealth. Those who haven't have not. So somebody might respond, that's all well and good. You increase economic freedom, it raises average levels of income. But the problem isn't average levels. The problem is it's just the wealthy people getting wealthy, the poor people getting poor. This looks at just the income of the poorest 10% of the population. I think Tony said something yesterday, where would you like to be a poor person? In the United States or somewhere else? And then he made the comparison even more. Would you like to be the King of England in 1600 or a poor person in the United States today? I myself would certainly take a poor person in the United States today. Here, we're just looking at poorest 10% in economic freedom. What you find, top 20%, you're about $7,000 per capita. When you get down here, it's much less for even them. So it's not just that the rich are getting richer when you have higher economic freedom. The bottom's getting pulled up too. So income isn't the only thing that matters, so we can look at a bunch of things. And in fact, if you go to the Free the World website and look at the research papers, people have run statistical relationships between economic freedom and just about any measure of well-being that you could imagine. This particular one happens to be infant mortality. You're much more likely to have a child live at birth if you're in a high freedom country. Apparently I don't have some of the other ones on this, but they have other ones that do like literacy rates. They do the UN Human Development Index. There's basically tons of different things. Basically almost every measure of well-being that you can find, there's a relationship between having more economic freedom, getting you more of that. And you can find that stuff on the Free the World site. This looks at economic freedom and changes in economic freedom and growth. So looking at a 1 unit change of economic freedom, how does it impact GDP growth over the time versus a 1 unit difference in level? Where am I? Oh, and this is sorting out time periods too. So, it'll take a little bit more talking to get through this one. Basically what this is testing is it that growth causes freedom, or is it that freedom causes growth? And what they're looking at is changes in freedom, whether a change in freedom in the 1980s does more to explain growth over the 1980s through 2000 than a change in freedom in the 90s does. Because if it was growth driving freedom, then you get a stronger impact on the second than the first. That's not what they're finding. Basically, economic freedom's causing changes in the growth. Another thing that's important is investment. Find more economically free, you get more investment. I was going to say 75 minutes. Wow, that's the wrong card. Level of economic freedom per worker, level of investment per worker. We're talking about ranges of freedom scores here. You find you get more total investment, you also get more foreign investment. So foreigners are more likely to invest in your country when you have higher economic freedom. And interestingly, this is cool, the productivity of investment. There's definitely an Austrian interpretation of what's going on here. Here they're looking at how does a change in freedom impact how much growth you get out of any given level of investment. So invest a certain percent per capita of GDP. How much does that translate into GDP growth the next year? Well, remember I said prices yesterday when we were talking about business cycles. Prices coordinate activity. So if entrepreneurs are trading on the basis of these prices, if those prices are real signals, they're more likely to be correct in their investments and promote growth. If not, if the prices aren't right, they're going to make errors, things that end up in business losses and don't produce growth. Here what we're looking at is, as economic freedom changes, how much are entrepreneurs right or wrong with their investments, kind of. And what you're finding is in higher freedom places, you get more growth in GDP out of a given level of investment than in a place where you have less freedom. And interestingly, compare that to what they try to measure public investment. So this is a big government builds roads. You get even less growth out of that than you do even in the least free countries, the private investment, where the signals are the worst. And that's because here the signals are perfectly absent. How does a government decide which road to build? They don't have the profit and loss system to sort this out for them. So even if they're trying to be a benevolent government and just provide infrastructure for the public good, they don't know how to best do it. The price signal's missing. So it doesn't generate as much growth. We'll conclude here with just a couple interesting questions. So if economic freedom is so important for growth, and countries like Botswana who have succeeded in Africa have high levels of economic freedom, how does foreign aid interact with this? So while aid itself might not cause the growth, how does aid impact the freedom? And this is something that P.T. Bauer, a famous development economist, long contended, that aid on net promotes statism. He says it politicizes economic life. The more aid that comes into the country, entrepreneurs are going to seek getting that aid transferred to them rather than seek how they can best serve their fellow citizens. So one of my grad students and I, Matt Ryan, went around and we started using the Economic Freedom Index and flows of aid, controlling for other factors that would get you the aid, started looking at how does aid impact economic freedom. And what we find is as you get more aid, it makes you less economically free. So you start actually getting worse freedom scores and hence worse growth. Other interesting research that's more recent than being done, Bob Lawson, one of the co-authors of this index, has a paper on the Hayek-Friedman hypothesis about the stability of a relationship between economic and political freedom, and whether economic freedom causes more political freedom or vice versa. And there are individual measures within U.S. states that find, while not as dramatic a difference, because all the states within the United States are relatively closer in terms of freedom than, say, the U.S. and Zimbabwe, you still find basically the same story within there. So with that, I'll conclude and start taking questions on economic freedom and growth generally. Yes? Have I ever looked at Haiti at all? Only from a plane as I flew over it. I don't really know much about it. Do you have something in particular about it that you think and would like to share? Yeah, I'm sure they're low in the index, but I don't know their particular number. If I was hooked up to the internet right now, I'd pull up the index and we could get everybody, but I don't know their particular score. Yeah?
Lisa Moya just recently put out a book called Debt Aid in Africa, and she proposes something like cutting all foreign aid to Africa in 5 years. What did you say about that?
Why the hell are we waiting 5 years? Do it all. So let me be clear. All economic development aid, I would cut tomorrow. Food aid, you probably have to phase out more slowly, because the food aid that's in there has destroyed local markets, and if you just cut it off tomorrow, people would starve. So you have to announce that it's being cut off, and then phase it off so that private markets grow to replace it. Humanitarian aid, well, I don't think the government should be doing it. Private humanitarian aid that does things like vaccinations and medical stuff, I think that's okay. And on net can make people better off. I think quite often it misses localized knowledge and things and does errors, but medical aid of all of the aids, of all of the quote aid that's given from the West to Africa might be the only on net beneficial maybe. Other things that we could do to help poorer countries right away. Actually, I'll pause on that. I'll get to that next lecture on some of the other things.
I was just say one note on that, on ending aid, if you want to see how you're going to do it. The United States is ending about $80 million of aid to India, and it's very interesting to think about exactly how they're phasing that out in different states and stuff, as they're ending the entire program.
So
Now to 2017 is the way they're stepping down aid. So.
okay, so the point was that there's a decrease in aid going to India, and they're stepping it out over the next 8 years. Yeah?
As far as I understand, most of the foreign aid is given from government to government. So the new alternative is giving microloans or micro-aid. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit mixed on the microloans thing. So I think the first part of the question is, most of the aid is given government to government. What about things that go directly to people like micro lending? Yes, I think a big part of the problem with aid is that it goes from government to government, and ultimately what we have in in a lot of these countries are very inefficient political equilibria, where there's a ruler in power who doesn't have it in his interest to let the country grow. Throwing aid that goes through him just entrenches their power. Basically, it allows them to buy more military. It allows them, even when they're just handing out the money, to buy more political support and keep them there, and not actually change their institutions. So I think that's a huge problem. What we want is regime change in these countries. What I want, anyway, is regime change in these countries to regimes that will promote more economic freedom. Aid tends to lock it in more, I think, government to government. Then, when government spends it, they don't know what to spend it on, even if they were trying to be benevolent. So you have interest and incentive problems going on, information and incentive problems going on. When it comes to the micro thing, hold on, it's going to take me a second, guys. When it comes to the micro lending can be useful. So micro lending is private lending, usually, although governments have got involved in it. In particular, Grameen Bank gets subsidies. But it can be useful at moving people from like the $1 a day level of income to like the $3 a day type level of income, so like extreme poverty. So what micro lending does is it typically goes into a community, lends directly to individuals who are running their own businesses and want to grow their business, and it will lend to a collective, to a bunch of individuals all at once. One of the traditional models is they lend to women and not men, because they found that women are more likely to pay back, and they'll lend it to like 5 people in the community. And for all of them to be eligible to get another microloan in the future, all 5 have to make their payments. So you start getting social norms within the community enforcing the repayments, which does have other problems sometimes of violence between people, but for the most part it makes it so the loans are more likely to get paid back and you're more willing to give the loans. But these loans are very micro. So it's like you raise cattle, it's a loan to get you 2 more cattle. You raise chickens, it's a way to get you a better chicken coop. It's small, it's very micro stuff, which is why it helps people who are desperately poor get from that $1 to like $3 a day level, who don't have access, by the way, to normal credit, because they don't have access to the formal banking systems of their country quite often. So it's useful for that. But by its nature, it's micro. A lot of these people are what we'd call in kind of emergency entrepreneurship. They're individual entrepreneurs not because they really have a great comparative advantage at being an entrepreneur and building a business, but because there's no employment opportunities for them other than doing this. And part of the reason there's no employment opportunity is because the institutional system in that country sucks. And even if they were one of the entrepreneurs who would be successful in building a bigger business, so sure, you start getting more, producing a little bit more clothing or bringing more animals through. Well, now you need to hire an employee and you want to buy a factory. You're going to really grow. What do you start running into? All of that formal institutions that are licensing regimes, taxation, inflation, everything else that's going on in these countries. So it's like there's a glass ceiling or a wooden ceiling like this above it. If that microloan gets you from that $1 to $3 a day, but for you to expand your business beyond that, you start bumping up against it. For long-term growth, so I don't think it's like a long-term growth strategy for countries. It helps on the margin while you're really poor, but for long-term growth, we got to change those institutions. And they have to change those institutions. An interesting question that I don't think we have the answer to yet is, in the process of micro-lending, does it create cultural capital that helps people demand changes in institutions? So basically, by giving people more of a stake in a market system, do they start demanding other interventions get rolled back so they can grow their business? That could be a really interesting dynamic. I don't think we have good enough evidence for it yet. In countries where it's had micro-lending the longest, like Bangladesh, we don't see much evidence for that. But I'm open to seeing if that happens in the future, because it seems plausible, at least, that it could create such cultural capital. All right, catch you.
This is probably a stupid question, but I'll ask anyway. I think it was under the competition and entrepreneurship session, the quote was brought up, there's no solutions, only trade-offs. And so my question is, what possible negative side effects would there be to massive government deregulation or, a badly handled increase in economic freedom?
Okay, so this is a good question, I think. So that's got to be a Corelli quote, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. That was his quote, right?
He was quoting someone else, but yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like something Tony would say. I agree with that too, by the way. So of course there's trade-offs to increasing economic freedom. Trade-offs that I think are certainly good for the overall population. But it is clear that there are people who benefit from the lack of economic freedom who would lose in the transition. So people who enjoy positions of privilege because of government regulation will get poorer, at least initially, when economic freedom increases. Other people who, so I guess there are other people who benefit from the restrictions who will get displaced. So just for example, you have you have limited freedom to trade internationally, and then overnight you abolish the tariffs. The structure of production in your country, the industries that exist there, aren't the industries you should have. You should have different industries based on comparative advantage that you were learning yesterday. And you only have the ones you do because of those restrictions. And the people who went into them might not have been like, evil people who were lobbying for this or whatever. It's just people trying to make a living. And given what they could make a living doing, the price signal said, do these industries. You drop your trade barriers overnight, some of those people need to go bankrupt and switch into other jobs. So there'll be a transition like that that'll impoverish some people in the interim. But on net, they're going to be wealthier once they make the transition, and I'd say it's a cost well worth bearing. So then your question was, a poorly handled increase in economic freedom. This is really problematic. Not your statement, but thinking about how to optimally, for the Mises phrase, planning for freedom. Like how, and this is a socialist transition question as well. If markets are important, how do we optimally plan to move to the market? And if we can actually optimally plan to move to the market, why couldn't we optimally plan to start with? So there's a real problem of dynamics of interventionism if you try to roll things back slowly. So like Mises' dynamics of interventionism. One intervention in the economy creates secondary and undesirable consequences. So what do you usually do? Put in another intervention to deal with that. And you keep tending down the road to serfdom as you put in more of these. Well, if you roll them back, what do you end up seeing? Some of those other unintended consequences you didn't like of prior regulations. So you got to roll that one back, and you got to do. But the point is, if you do them slowly like that, you're always getting these undesirable consequences popping up. And people's natural reaction to them will see, look, deregulation doesn't work. We've got to go back and re-regulate. That's how you get there in the first place. Unless you can explain, no, that's from this other regulation, we've got to keep doing that. But that's a hard thing to keep the momentum on. So in general, I'm a fan of more shock therapy to this, of make the big increase in economic freedom. There's going to be a big transition cost, but you at least won't be dealing with this dynamics of interventionism always pushing you backwards. That said, from the outside, the development economists at the fall of the Soviet Union thought the transition for Eastern Europe would be much more easy. And it was first, they said, oh, we just got to get prices right. If prices are right, the economy will order itself. Sure, you need prices right, but how can you get prices right? You need to get institutions in place, institutions of economic freedom that support that. So, okay, then the question became, let's get institutions right. But you can't just give someone institutions. So have any of you seen The Commanding Heights, the movie series, the documentary? It's great. Part of it's great. I love episode 1. They butcher a few things, like they have an awful quote about Hayek, where like Hayek being unkind because he says, let the Great Depression continue. And it's like, no, that's falling out of the cycle theory. He's saying we got to get rid of the bad investments. Anyway, overall, though, episode 1's pretty cool. After that, the other episodes go way downhill. And the third one is really awful. It's got Jeff Sachs in it, and he's going around and basically he's like, yes, so I'm in the country, I forget which country it was now, maybe Poland. I'm advising them after the collapse of communism. And they said, okay, we need a plan of how we're going to transition. It's like, so I went to bed that night, and I stayed up all night instead, and I wrote a plan for them. And then they had to do it the next day. And it's like, you can't just take institutions and stick them somewhere. So yeah, you need to get institutions right, but what we found is when you stick institutions that aren't homegrown and supported domestically, you don't get rationality out of those, so you need to get culture right. How do you get culture right? That's an evolutionary spontaneous order process that's happening there. It's about the spread of ideas among them. So like, while I say shock therapy because of this logic, it's hard to do from the outside. It's got to be internal demands for freedom and a culture that supports and enforces that on their government. And that's a much more complex social change question that I don't have great answers to. I have thoughts about it and like to chat with people and learn more. Yeah?
You put up that slide of how economic freedom has increased like, in aggregate in the world.
Yep.
Do you think that'll decrease now with the increases inside governments in response to their government?
Possibly, yeah. The question was, I showed the graph with the increases of economic freedom around the world. With the response to the worldwide financial crisis, might that go in the other direction now in the short term? I think quite possibly, yeah. When I see an increase in size of governments from a lot of these countries, it might tick it down. I'd have to know more about like China and precisely what they're doing in response, because some of that reform more recently has been driven by bigger changes in China, and so I'd like to think about some of those countries more individually. It's certainly possible, but it wouldn't reverse the overall trend that I was showing you. Like when we're going, I forget what the actual numbers were, but in terms of the height of those things, what I'd expect this is to be a minor blip down, and hopefully corrected shortly thereafter. But it's certainly possible that there are international events that start destroying freedom, like World War I. Hopefully this isn't one of them. Yeah?
You put a slide up there about the growth of the, I thought it was, you put the poorest 10% of these countries. What about the argument regarding the growing disparity between the very wealthy and the very poor? And that these market reforms lead to that.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily agreeing with that, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say with regards to that. What does the data show?
Yeah, so other people have done research on economic freedom and inequality, and generally they don't find that increases in that higher levels, if I get this right, I'm not so I want you to look it up for yourself on the Free the World website because you can find a bunch of papers on it. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe it is, increased levels of economic freedom don't get you increased inequality, but I'd hazard a guess that changes in economic freedom increase inequality in the interim. Because some people like everybody started poor, some people grow and others don't. You get a change, but then as you level, the inequality starts to disappear. That's my kind of thinking like an economist hypothesis of probably how it happens. But there's a lot of empirical research, and some other people do that. It's just, quite honestly, inequality of incomes is not a topic that I care about. I don't really read about it. I know a lot of people, of course, are concerned with it. But like the level of the poorest 10% matters a heck of a lot more to me than the ratios. Just envy is not something that really resonates with me. If someone else is doing better, cool for them. I really don't experience it, but a lot of people are very concerned about that. Yeah.
Could you discuss a little bit more about the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom? Does one drive the other?
Yeah, so the question is, can I talk a little bit more about the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom? The two definitely don't need to go together. There are places that are politically fairly free and economically fairly repressed. India was one for a while. There's places that are not politically free at all, but are very economically free. Singapore has been number 2 in the index for over 30 years now. So they don't have to go hand in hand. But the new research on this puts it basically into the quadrants of not free, 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 and then economic and political freedom, one but not the other. And that there tends to be kind of clockwise motion in it. Pushing countries that are economically free tend to get more political freedom over time. And that Friedman and Hayek both talked about in other instances that it's not really possible to have a large degree of political freedom without a large degree of economic freedom. Because if you depend on the government basically for your income, how free are you in really choosing those people who are determining your economic fate? So Hayek's got a lot in this in The Road to Serfdom. That you can't meaningfully have political freedom without economic freedom. Is that a little bit more? Yeah.
I was wondering how the economic freedom of U.S. territories, like let's say Virgin Islands or any U.S.-controlled chain of islands or any U.S.-controlled territory compares to the mainland itself.
It's a great question. I don't know the answer. So the question was, how does the freedom of any U.S. territory compare with U.S. states? And I don't know the answer to it. I'm trying to think just casually because my brother lives in the Virgin Islands. He lives on St. Thomas. And I've been down there a number of times, and he tells me all sorts of interesting stories about various insane regulations and things there. And other things that it seems so free there aren't in others. I don't know of any systematic evidence on. The index, of course, completely misses it because it's just looking at overall national policies that would apply to the overall country. You're certainly more free to sin in the Virgin Islands. Alcohol taxes are absent. Cigarette taxes are absent. Rum is actually cheaper than the mixers, so they have places that are pour your own bars. They just stick the bottle of liquor in front of you and the bottle of soda, and since people systematically overpour their liquor, it saves them money. At the same time, actually, the Virgin Islands have one of the coolest cases of failure of aid that I have on a picture of. They have there the bridge to nowhere. So it was U.S. government transfers to them to spend on infrastructure, and they had money in their bridge budget, but they didn't have any bridges that needed to be built. So they literally built, not like the Alaska one that was actually going to connect an island to something, they built a bridge to nowhere. It sits in the middle of a field. It's not connected to a road on either side. There's no river or anything, right? It's just a bridge sitting there. They all call it the bridge to nowhere, so I visited and took some pictures. But perversely, it did end up promoting economic development in a way. The Virgin Verve, which is kind of like an alternative newspaper, I saw an ad in it one time selling T-shirts from the bridge to nowhere. So it did spur some business activity. So, other than with cute little stories, I don't have any systematic evidence on this. It's an interesting question, though. Yeah.
Going on that question, what about from state to state? I know California, the regulations are going crazy, so a lot of businesses are leaving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, California doesn't do very well on that index. So there's one called Economic Freedom of North America, and it does all of the U.S. states and the Canadian provinces. And there's also one called the I'm going to get the name of it wrong. It's published by Pacific Research that does the 50 states, Economic Freedom Index in the states. In general, what I would use, if you're going to look at one, the Pacific Research one does get good popular press, but I'd look at the Fraser Institute one again, the one that does North America, and if you're just concerned about the U.S. states, sort out Canada yourself. Reason being, I was a reviewer on the Pacific Research one, and if I recall correctly, when they did the weighting of it, because they were trying, so there's always a problem of how do you weight, so in terms of the international index, inflation versus taxes. Or what if they have a minimum wage and there's inflation? Should both of those things count equally? Or is inflation way more damaging to economic freedom than a minimum wage? How do you weight them? And people have experimented with different weighting schemes. And it's all a bit arbitrary and kind of personal preference. And one kind of obvious way to do it is take a look and see what the effect of those interventions are. So if you find inflation really kills GDP a lot, and a minimum wage doesn't much, maybe then weight inflation more heavily, which kind of makes sense of seeing the outcomes, but at the same time it makes your index worthless for actually comparing levels of freedom to how well you do. And the U.S. and the Pacific Research one, if I remember, they weighted their different categories by doing a regression first on how it impacts changes in population levels and changes in manufacturing output in the states, which means you can't use it to compare differences in freedom with differences in good things, because it's already got it in there.
So do you have access to how it's weighted and what is actually contributed? Say you're looking to go into a specific business in a certain state.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have access to those things to see what it matters to your business?
Yeah, so if you do, so I can talk more about the North America one from Fraser than the Pacific Research one. There, if you go to the question again is, if you're opening up a business in a particular state, can you go in and look at these different categories and kind of more, instead of just saying Freedom 7, where it comes from? Yeah. So the Fraser Institute, for their world one and for the state one, you can go in and you get the data, and it shows you category by category, and it's not just size of government, then you get all of the subcomponents within that, and it shows you all of the scores from that and how they've changed over time. So relatively fine information that you can get there. Yeah?
How much of the government should, since we know we're expanding, our government is expanding at a rapid rate, how much of the government, percentage-wise, should we cut to have optimal economic freedom?
The question is, how much of the government should we cut percentage-wise to have optimal economic freedom? So this is a question that the economic freedom indexes themselves actually avoid by having 10 not be the definition of absolute freedom. Basically, they didn't want to get into the debate over this. And I kind of said this, I guess someone pushed me on my first lecture on this a little bit, would a minimal state be just a very small tax level to support national defense, courts, police, and the definition of what property rights are? Would it be that it just says what the property rights are and maybe provides the national defense, but lets private business provide the security and provide the actual adjudication? Because, heck, most of that's already done privately anyway in terms of private security and arbitration and mediation and business law. Or would it just do none of that and totally disappear and allow private governance and associations to do it? In terms of translating that into numbers, regardless of what your answer to that question is, it's somewhere over 95% of what current government is, if you have that classical liberal view. And then after that, it's just a debate whether it's 95 or 100%, or where in between. Yeah?
So what do you think that the limit that the Constitution puts on federal governments is still too big?
Oh, yeah. So the question was, would I say that the limits the Constitution puts on the federal government, is that still too big? And that was my oh yeah before I even repeated the question. I mean, it's got all sorts of things in there that you simply don't need. A mandated post office, for example. Other things that I think, I'm more of an Articles of Confederation guy if I had to choose, which I think is more limiting. Or for that matter, minus slavery type issues, the Confederate Constitution in some ways probably being superior to the U.S. one. That doesn't mean I'm a states' rights person. I think I was talking about this with someone last night. States don't have rights. Individuals have rights. But the question is more state control versus national control. I think you could do more for state control. So yeah, U.S. Constitution's too intrusive. There's a book, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, that gets into the interest group politics of how creating the U.S. Constitution benefited particular interests, because there's this kind of noble notion of everybody got together and wrote down the rules for society at that time, and this was necessarily a good thing. That doesn't bear into the interpretation of the economic interpretation of what interest groups lead. And this isn't the Constitution directly, but I remember interesting, because the founding fathers, they all get so much of a pass on things. I was reading Ben Franklin's autobiography, and in it was interesting. He was talking about how when people advocate different public things, different governmental policies, they almost always have their private interests in mind. And I'm like, yeah. And then, like 5 pages later, he's talking about how the government needs to print more paper money. And a few pages after that, how he has the contract as a printer to print the government money for them. And how he was in debt at the time, and printing more paper money creates inflation, which makes the real value of his debts go down. Like, you SOB. But anyway, that's not Constitution directly, but that's some of that. Lecture's over. We've got another one in 15 minutes or something like that. Thank you all.